Hi, I wanted to make a short video on our topic this week of a history of economic thought. I'm going to go through several well known economists over the past few centuries and influencers on economic thought. And I want to start by going back to 1776 and talking about Adam Smith. Adam Smith lived from 1723 to 1790, and in 1776 published the first version of a book that we call now The Wealth of Nations. And The Wealth of Nations was a very important book in economics. We date it today as sort of the beginning of modern economic history. In here, Smith says and lays out the case for how trade increases wealth and how open trade and voluntary trade among individuals makes everyone better off, and how everyone working together, pursuing their own goals, their own interests, can make a community, a country, and an economy better off. He wrote it in 1776, and it's not a coincidence that that's the same year that the Declaration of Independence was written. The U.S. founding fathers knew Adam Smith's work very well, both the work on the Wealth of Nations and his 1759 work, The Theory of Moral Sentiments. Both lay out an economic case for how trade and voluntary exchange is positive for an economy and a country. When the U.S. framers wrote the Constitution several years after the Revolutionary War, they included no possible tariffs between the different states, which means states cannot charge tariffs, taxes, or fees on goods and services being imported from other states or being exported to other states. This is one of the major findings of Adam Smith's work. And because of that, we rate Smith as really the beginning of modern economic thought. We go on through several other philosophers and thinkers of the time who are working in economics before we even have a modern term of economics. David Hume worked very closely with Adam Smith. He was a colleague of Adam Smith. Like Adam Smith, he was a Scotsman. He lives from 1711 to 1776 itself, and he lays out a philosophical basis of economics and markets and money, and does a lot of work on trade theory. We also see an economist known as David Ricardo, who lives from 1772 until 1823. And Ricardo lays out the ideas of comparative advantage. David Ricardo does a lot of work in labor markets, in trade theory, and we begin to see in the 1800s this idea of trade building wealth and voluntary exchange really coming into its own. And then in the 1800s, Karl Marx, who lives from 1818 to 1883, writes first the Communist Manifesto in 1849. And then between about 1867 and 1873, he publishes in several different stages Das Kapital, or in English, just sort of capital. And Marx lays out the idea of socialism and communism. And he lays out the idea that instead of many different people engaging in voluntary trade and voluntary exchange, that the state should collectively own the means of production, and the state should control production and decide what needs to be produced and what doesn't. And this is a very, very uh, new idea that the state, through a government, not necessarily a king or a monarch, should decide what should be produced and decide how much should be produced. We're talking about farms and factories, so the state should decide how much corn and wheat is grown, how many factories there should be, how many people they should hire. The state should decide who people should work for. And this is an appealing idea that there's someone in control, that there's a state in control, in charge, making sure there's enough corn, enough wheat. And this idea will have absolutely disastrous consequences, as we see. When states begin to implement Karl Marx's idea, we really see this beginning in the Russian Revolution of 1917, when Vladimir Lenin leads a revolution in Russia and begins to implement socialist Marxist policies. And they begin having collective farms where people are moved onto farms, and the state decides what will be farmed and who will work where. And it almost immediately begins to fail. And it's about 5 years later, in 1923, when Lenin sort of proposes and changes and says, well, we'll allow some private property and some small businesses, but he says the Russian government is going to control what he calls the commanding heights of the economy. The government will control the railways and farming and steel and the military. He says we will keep control over the commanding heights of the economy. And over 1917, going forward into the 1900s, we see sort of this rise of the idea of socialist thought and that government should be in charge, and the idea of Adam Smith, where individuals pursuing their own best interests leads to positive outcomes for the community, the country, begins to fall into disarray in a large part of the world as more and more countries begin to adopt more socialist policies and move away from voluntary trade and international trade. And in 1881, an economist is born who lives until 1973, named Ludwig von Mises. And von Mises takes the absolute opposite approach of Marx. He actually writes a small book titled simply Socialism, where von Mises explains that socialism cannot work, will not work, and eventually will fail because it doesn't have the important parts of an economy, namely prices. That he says for the first time that the important thing about an economy is prices, that prices send the idea of what is rare, what is scarce, what is valuable, and an economy where prices are not free to rise and fall based on the laws of the market and supply and demand will not be able to succeed. And Mises first makes this case, and it's followed up by several of his students, including Friedrich August Hayek, who, like Mises, is an Austrian. And Hayek expounds on Mises' work with prices as information carriers. Hayek says that markets will coordinate. Markets will use the price system to tell us what is valuable, what's useful, what's scarce, what we need to produce more of, what we need to produce less of. He says that this supply and demand system, combined with voluntary trade and voluntary exchange and a working price system, will lead to better outcomes for everyone that a government simply cannot know. Hayek says that a government simply can't have all of the possible information that prices convey to us in a system where prices are allowed to float. And Hayek wins the Nobel Prize for his work in economics in 1974. And after he wins this Nobel Prize, his ideas start to take hold. And at this point, we see around the world that the socialist countries like the Soviet Union and China are not doing well. They don't have the life expectancy, they don't have the quality of life as the capitalist countries like the US and Western Europe. And Hayek's ideas really begin to take hold after he wins that Nobel Prize in 1974. The great intellectual foil to F.A. Hayek is John Maynard Keynes. John Maynard Keynes and F.A. Hayek were both at Cambridge in Great Britain at the same time. Keynes is British. He is the great British economist who basically invents what we think of as modern macro on his own. He lives from 1883 until 1946. And Keynes himself is absolutely fascinating. He's a brilliant genius. He worked with the British government in World War I to end the war and set up the economic systems after the war that would lead the combatants in World War I back into the world of nations and sort of build their economies. But they don't listen to Hayek, and they impose massive reparations on the German state. They make them pay for the cost of the war and pay and pay and pay. Keynes is furious. He can see that this isn't going to work. It's going to bankrupt Germany. They'll never be able to build a strong modern economy. He walks out of the negotiations furious, goes back to Britain and writes a book saying this will never work. The price of the peace is too high. It's going to set us up for disaster later. In World War II, Keynes is proven right. Germany never builds the kind of strong, robust economy that prevents their people from falling under the heel of another dictator. Keynes works throughout World War II, basically planning and managing the British wartime economy as a member of the Bank of Governors for the Bank of Britain. Works himself furiously. He writes a book called The General Theory. It's the general theory of money, credit, and interest, where he lays out modern macroeconomics really for the first time and introduces tracking things like gross domestic product and inflation and interest rates and price level. And it's an absolute masterwork that Keynes does. He writes the general theory and lays out much of what we think of as modern macroeconomics. And he holds sort of counter views to Hayek, where Hayek says that people need information, people need prices, people free to leave on their own will build a strong economy and produce what needs to be produced. Keynes has the exact opposite view. He's not in any way, shape, or form a socialist like Marx and Lenin and the Russians, but he does believe in very strong government intervention in markets. He believes that governments need to have a very strong hand and a very strong role in what gets produced and who it gets produced for. He's a strong fan of strong government regulation. And the ideas of these two men, of Hayek and Keynes, will be in contrast throughout the rest of the 20th century as governments and economies struggle to determine what is the right level of sort of government influence and government intervention and regulation, where we know that markets and voluntary exchange is the best and fastest way to build wealth, to build an economy, to have a high standard of living. But the ideas of Hayek and Keynes are with us today, where we ask how much government intervention do we need, how much do we want, and throughout the 20th century and the 21st, as we've seen the socialist economies around the world collapse and fail, and socialism has failed under its own weight every single place that it's been tried, We still worry with how much government regulation and how much government interference in markets is appropriate, how much do markets need. And as we've moved through and seen other economists like Friedman and the Chicago School and Eleanor Ostrom, who won the Nobel Prize at Indiana University for looking at how resources in common can be shared most effectively, we're still contending with these ideas of Keynes and Hayek today and how much government intervention is necessary in an economy. So I'm going to leave it there. Thank you very much. Please look at the other materials, and I'll talk to you next time.